Hello, everyone. Welcome to RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On the program today, we're going to talk all about running economy. And as people join us, we'll get into some questions. But we're going to take you all the way back to the 1930s. In 1930, there was a famous, who wasn't famous at the time, but he became a famous physiologist, Archibald Vivian Hill, and D.B. Dill, David Bruce Dill. And most notably, David Bruce Dill noticed that when you put a bunch of people on a treadmill, and after you measure their VO2 max, when you put a bunch of people on a treadmill and have them run at a given percentage of their VO2 max, or at sub-maximum speeds, him and his colleagues noticed that there is marked differences in the amount of oxygen people use to maintain a given sub-maximal speed. And so even if you take a bunch of people with the same VO2 max values, they don't all cross the finish line together. So there must be something else or other things that are influencing running performance. So David Bruce Dill and his colleagues at the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory, which doesn't exist anymore, but this was all the way back in the 1930s. Harvard was very well known for the field of exercise science, the very early days of exercise science. And so they put a bunch of people on a treadmill and had them run at different sub-maximum speeds in addition to their max speed to get the VO2 max. And they noticed that there were a lot of differences between the amount of oxygen that people consume running at different sub-maximum speeds. And so they called this running economy. Similar to fuel economy in a car. That's the way you can conceptualize it. So let's look at an example. Say you have Jack and Jill who run up a hill to fetch a pail of water at 8 minute per mile pace. And say they both have the exact same VO2 max. But when they're both running, they have the exact same VO2 max, so their ceiling is the same. And let's say they're both running at 80%, or let's say 70%. They both run 70% of their VO2 max to run an 8 minute. They both run an 8 minute mile pace. But let's say Jack is running at 70% of that VO2 max to maintain 8 minute mile pace, but Jill is running at 80% of her VO2 max to run that 8 minute mile pace. Then who's more economical? You would say that Jack is more economical, because to maintain the same pace with the same VO2 max, Jack is running at 10% less of his VO2 max. He's running 70% of the VO2 max to maintain that pace, whereas Jill is running at 80%. So the other way you can look at it is that if Jack were also to run at 80% of the VO2 max to match the same percentage as Jill, then he would be running faster. So there's a couple of ways that you can look at what running economy is. You can look at it the way we measure it in a lab, which is the percentage of the VO2 max that you're able to sustain, how much oxygen you consume to maintain a given percentage of the VO2 max. Or you can look at it in terms of speed, how fast you're running when you're running at a given percentage of your VO2 max. And that's why running economy is extremely important. In fact, it's the most important of the three physiological variables. We already talked about VO2 max in the very first episode of the show. And VO2 max is, of course, very important. You have to have a high VO2 max to be a good runner. But in terms of training and in terms of your ability to sustain a high percentage of that VO2 max, the running economy is actually the most important, because it tells you how fast am I running when I'm running at 70% of my VO2 max, or 80% of my VO2 max, or 90% of my VO2 max. How fast am I running when I'm doing that? And so obviously, the faster that you're running when you're running at a given percentage of the VO2 max, the better it's going to be, the faster runner you're ultimately going to be. And so running economy represents either the amount of oxygen that you consume to maintain a given speed, and you want to consume as little oxygen as possible to run at a given speed. Just like in your car, you want to use as little gasoline as possible to maintain a given speed in your car. It's the same concept for the running economy. So even if you have the same VO2 max as somebody else, you could be using less oxygen to run at a given speed compared to that other person, even if the VO2 max is exactly the same. So it's very interesting, the issue of economy and how it relates to the VO2 max, or even if it's related at all, and how it affects performance. So what do you do about it? Well, there's few ways actually that you can figure out how economical you are, but they all require being in a laboratory. So you can't just look at somebody. People think that, well, just by looking at someone, you can tell if they're an economical runner or not, and that's not really true. Because running technique has little to do with running economy. It has something to do with it, but little to do with it. It has more to do with what's going on inside of the muscles, which is something you can't see. So we talked in the first episode about how VO2 max is much more cardiovascularly limited, your stroke volume and cardiac output, whereas running economy is more muscularly limited. It's about what's going on inside of the muscles, how good the mitochondria are at consuming oxygen and using it in aerobic metabolism. So it's not something that you can visually see. Obviously, if you watch a runner, you can tell somebody who looks ugly when they run. You can tell someone who looks beautiful when they run. But that has a minor effect on what's going on inside of their body. So you can't really tell just by looking at somebody, if they're economical or not. You have to be in a laboratory and actually measure oxygen consumption at different speeds. I actually did this quite a lot when I was back at school and I was working on my PhD. In fact, for my dissertation, I measured running economy in runners because that was one thing I was looking at, is how the coordination of breathing and stride rate, if there's an economical advantage to coordinating those two rhythms. And so I measured running economy on everybody. And you can't just tell by looking at somebody if they're economical. You need some sophisticated equipment to be able to measure how much oxygen you consume at multiple different submax speeds. So the best way to find out how economical you are is to be in a lab and get tested at different speeds on a treadmill, where they connect you to an oxygen and carbon dioxide analyzer, and you're breathing into like this snorkel-like mouthpiece, and then you can find out how much oxygen you consume. Most runners, when they first start running, are very uneconomical because they just don't have the metabolic machinery in their leg muscles that are built up. Nothing's been built up yet. There's no machinery that's been built up. So most people, when they first start running, they consume a lot of oxygen even when they're running slow. They're not very economical. But it turns out that economy is very responsive to training. In fact, if you read the scientific research on elite runners and how they get better over the years, it's not really because they're improving their VO2 max. Once you're highly trained, the VO2 max pretty much plateaus and it doesn't keep changing. But you do become more economical. So running economy seems to be the thing that is affected most over the long term of a runner's running career. That's the thing that keeps improving, rather than changes in the VO2 max. The VO2 max will stay pretty stable. But runners who continue to get faster are getting faster mostly because of changes to economy, which is very interesting. And so economy is very adaptable, it's very responsive to training. And so how do you improve the economy? Well, one of the major things that will improve economy is the weekly volume. In fact, running with a high weekly mileage is the most significant factor, the most significant positive factor that is obtained from doing that is probably to the improvements in economy. And the way I always talk about this is that you could think of learning any skill. If you want to become better at playing the piano, or if you want to become a better swimmer, or if you want to become a better singer, you have to repeat the actions over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so it's the same concept with running. If you look at a child, for those of you who have children, when your kids first started to learn how to walk, it was very jerky. They walk like they're drunk. They're just trying to figure out how to make the movements to be able to walk. But then they stand up and they practice and they practice and they practice and they practice. And over time, your brain and your central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, learn how to talk to the motor units, to the muscle fibers, to recruit them in the most precise and synchronous way so that the movements then start to become automatic and smoother. And then children can walk like adults can. But when they first start, the term muscle memory is used a lot, but it's not really memory of the muscle. It's really about how the brain and the central nervous system is communicating, how it's sending signals to the motor units to be able to recruit them in a synchronous way, rather than an asynchronous way where the movements would all be choppy and jumbled and going back to the kid, it looks like he's drunk when he first starts to walk. And so that's the way you could think of running, that when you repeat the running movements, even when you're running slow, if you repeat those movements over and over and over again, many, many thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times, then that you become a smoother or more economical runner, that your brain starts to become better at recruiting motor units for the task. And so this most significant attribute gained from running high mileage is probably the changes to economy, to making you more economical. And that's what the research shows, that the runners who are the most economical tend to be the ones who run the most, the high mileage runners. And so that's one great way to improve economy. Just run more. Over time, you increase how much running you do from month to month or week to week. You just run more and you become more economical that way. The other way that you can become more economical, which is an interesting area of relatively new research, is from heavy strength training. And again, it is really to target the central nervous system's ability to recruit motor units, muscle fibers. So technically, we don't recruit muscle fibers, we recruit motor units, which is a bunch of muscle fibers connected by a motor neuron, and they're in bundles. So you contract or you recruit motor units and all of the muscle fibers that are contained in that one motor unit. And so that's why I keep saying motor units instead of muscle fibers, because technically we're not recruiting individual muscle fibers, we're recruiting the entire motor unit, which has many muscle fibers connected to the motor neuron. And so when you do very heavy strength training, like very close to your 1 rep max, then you are forcing more motor units to be recruited, because you got to produce a lot of force in order to lift a very heavy weight. So strength training, I'll do a whole other show on strength training, but suffice it here to say that there's a lot of commotion about strength training and whether it helps distance running performance, and for the most part it does not. But if you do the strength training in a very particular way, using very heavy weights that you lift only a few times per set, where it's very close to your 1 rep max, that research shows that you can improve running economy through a neural mechanism, through a motor unit recruitment mechanism. So it all gets back to motor unit recruitment. So it seems to be the way that we improve running economy is through improvements in the recruitment of motor units, of muscle fibers. And so there's a few ways that you can do that. The constant repetition of running a lot of miles per week, as well as very heavy strength training that will force a lot of motor units to be recruited in a synchronous way so that you can lift the very heavy weight. So doing body weight exercises, jumping jacks and squat jumps and burpees and that kind of stuff, that's not going to improve running economy. It has to be very heavy strength training. There is some research to show that for the same reason, for this motor unit recruitment reason, that plyometrics can also help. So there's 2 major ways that you can improve what we call power, muscle power. And that's really what this is getting at. To improve economy, you can do it by improving power. And there's 2 ways that we can improve power, because power is force or strength times velocity or speed. The power equals force times velocity, or you can think of it as strength times speed. So we could do the very heavy lifting, which focuses on the strength component of power, to improve your maximum force production capability of the muscle. Or you can do it by improving the speed or velocity component of power by doing plyometric kinds of activities. So hops and jumps, do 1-legged hops up bleachers and things like that. That could also help to improve running economy. But having said all that little bit about the strength training, the plyometrics, I would first focus on the more specific running. So most people have room to run a lot more than they already do. Most people are running much less than they could to improve their performance. And so the first step would be to improve running economy through just increasing the weekly volume. Get the volume as high as you can physically and psychologically handle. You know, there's going to be a limit to everybody. Not everyone can run 100 miles a week, nor should they. Most people get injured on that. So run as much as you can physically handle, and without breaking yourself down. You know, and that'll improve running economy. So let's see if there are any questions as I'm talking. I just keep talking and talking, and I neglect the question. So let's see. Don't be afraid to ask some questions while we're talking, and otherwise I'll keep talking about economy. So economy is very interesting. It's apart from, like I said before, the VO2 max. And we know much more about VO2 max and even about lactate threshold, the other of the three physiological factors that influence performance. We know a lot more about VO2 max and lactate threshold than we do about running economy. We're still learning a lot about economy because unlike VO2 max or lactate threshold, we know specific workouts that we can do that will target improvements in those things. For running economy, it's much more difficult. You can't say, well, do this kind of a workout because it improves economy. It's much more difficult to specifically target improvements in running economy as opposed to VO2 max and lactate threshold. But we do know that running higher mileage improves economy, and we do know that the very heavy strength training can improve economy. Going back for a second to the heavy strength training, I wouldn't say that just because that could be valuable, don't just go into a gym and start lifting extremely heavy weights off the ground. You have to precede that kind of training with other kinds of training to prepare yourself, because that could be dangerous, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So make sure if you're going to do that kind of training that you have a spotter or you have a trainer or somebody else who can guide you with that, because you don't want to hurt yourself doing very heavy lifting when you're not, especially when you're not used to it. We got one question. Rick asks, what other types of exercises would recruit more muscle groups? You mentioned one-legged hop. Yeah, so you can think of anything that, we have two ways in which we regulate force production. Again, this could be a whole other show. But in order to increase the amount of force that the muscles produce, we do that by two ways, which you don't control. It's all controlled by your central nervous system. That we recruit more motor units and we increase the frequency at which those motor units are stimulated. So instead of sending a signal maybe once every 2 milliseconds, we'll send a signal down the axon of the motor neuron maybe once every 1 millisecond. So we regulate force production those two ways. And so anything that you do that is going to that requires you to produce more force, either by one of those two mechanisms, recruiting more motor units or increasing the frequency of stimulation of those motor units, will recruit more of the muscle. And so there's many different things that you can do, many different exercises, but it has to be something that forces you to produce more force. So whether it's hops, the plyometric kinds of activities where there's a lot of force production. And the thing about plyometric, again, this could be a whole other show. In fact, I'll make a whole other show on strength training and plyometric training, because it's a very interesting kind of training, even for a distance runner. But when you do those kinds of activities, you can't just take like baby little hops. You have to do something that's going to force your muscles to produce more force. So you have to try to jump up in the air as high as you can when you do those kinds of things, because you're not just taking like little baby hops off the ground. It's got to be something that makes the muscle produce more force. So you have to make it aggressive. So any kinds of hops or jumps or skips that are very aggressive, that force the muscle to produce more force, is going to recruit more of the muscle. It's going to recruit more motor units and increase the frequency of stimulation. So it could be very heavy strength training. It could be aggressive plyometrics. It could be any of that stuff. And you can get creative with it. It's sprinting also. When you sprint as fast as you can, or close to as fast as you can, then you're also recruiting more motor units. So anything that makes you recruit more motor units, then will increase power. So exercise with explosive. Yes, explosive is a good word. Yes, any kind of explosive types of exercise. It could be vertical jumps, like volleyball players. They're always doing explosive movements. Any kind of explosive, kind of ballistic kind of a movement, or it could be very heavy. When you lift very heavy, the motion is very slow. You can't lift a very heavy weight very quickly. That gets into some muscle mechanics. We'll save that for another show. But when you lift very heavy weights, you can't produce a lot of force very quickly. And so then you're moving very slowly. Then it's not explosive, but because you're lifting a very heavy weight, you're also going to recruit more of the muscle. Okay, another question. Bill Whitaker. Very good information, Jason. I always like to keep up and be reminded of good training methods even at my mature age. Okay, well, I have no idea how old you are, Bill, but we're all young here in social media land. Age doesn't exist in social media. We're all very young. Even with my gray hair, we're all very young. So that is a pretty quick summary about running economy, but I wouldn't neglect, a lot of people neglect running economy, not realizing that that is really, especially for longer races, for half marathon, for marathon, for ultra marathon, if you're crazy enough to do an ultra marathon, economy is where it's at. Just like in your car, I tend not to, I don't like to use analogies to a car because a car is not a changing system, it's static, whereas our bodies are constantly adapting, it's dynamic. But the analogy kind of works in this case, that you want to use as little gasoline as possible to drive at 60 miles an hour down the highway. The more gasoline you use to drive at a given speed, the worse the economy of the car, the worse the fuel economy. And you can think of the same thing as running economy, that the less oxygen that you consume to maintain a given speed, or the faster you're running at a given percentage of your VO2 max, then the more economical you are and the better runner you're going to be. And so, like I said earlier, perhaps the most significant attribute of running high mileage is the improvements in economy. And I even saw this, in the lab myself when I was, testing people in the lab. I had the opportunity to test people I was coaching when I was back in school working on my doctorate. That I had people in the lab that I was coaching, and I saw that their VO2 max didn't change. They were getting faster, but the VO2 max didn't change, but they got more economical. And so it's interesting, you get to see this for yourself firsthand, rather than just read it in a book somewhere. You get to see firsthand that economy is really what's driving the bus over years of training, that the VO2 max will tend to plateau, and you won't see any further improvements in the VO2 max. But you will become more economical through years and years of running more volume. Bill says, I was old when you were on the team. I remember Bill Whitaker. Yes, I do remember you, Bill. Good to see you. Thank you for joining. Yes, the days of Penn State. I love Penn State. Wish I could go back there. It'd be so much fun to go back there. But the winters were brutal, Bill. So much snow, but it's such a beautiful place where the campus is covered in snow. Absolutely beautiful. Now I live in San Diego. I don't get to see any snow anymore. But absolutely beautiful. Good. Thank you for joining us, Bill. Bill's a great guy. I remember him. Brings back a lot of memories from Penn State. So let's see how we can get to some more questions on both on Facebook and Instagram. If you're checking both on Facebook and Instagram, at running economy. So it's interesting. Economy's been around a long time. David Bruce Dill back in 1930s at the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory. He was the first one to say, hey, we're going to measure the oxygen consumption at different sub-maximum speeds. I don't know if you see behind me, Bill, but I got my Penn State diploma is right back there. I got the picture of Old Main on the Penn State diploma. Good times. Miss those days. Now he's got me thinking about Penn State. So let's see if there's any more questions about running economy. So those are the two major ways to improve economy. Do it first by increasing the weekly volume and the monthly volume and the yearly volume, and then do it by we could try some heavy strength training with the plyometric training, because that also will help to recruit muscle fibers and motor units. We have another question. Is there a point at which your weekly mileage reaches beyond which there may be no or even diminishing returns? Of course, and that's the kind of the beauty of training. That's always been the romantic part of training for me, is to find out where your limits are. And so we all have this limit that we're going to stop adapting to. I always say that what makes an Olympian is that they have such great propensity for adaptation that they can run higher and higher and higher volumes of training. And number one, they don't get injured doing it, whereas most people would get injured doing very high volumes of training. And number two, they continue to make physiological adaptations. They have very responsive DNA. They continue to make mitochondria. They continue to make a greater capillary network to perfuse the muscle fibers. They continue to become more economical. And that's what makes Olympians, that's one of the reasons why we look up to Olympians, because they're so talented, not just in what they have getting off their couch, but also in their ability to adapt to the training. Whereas each of us has to find out where our individual limits are. Some people might stop adapting at 40 miles a week. Some people might stop adapting at 60 miles a week. Some people might stop at 80 miles a week. And so for each of us, we have to find out where that point of diminishing returns gets. Whereas if you cross that line, you would get injured or you get sick or something negative happens. And so the beauty of training is for each of us to find out where is our point of no return, where is our ceiling, and that's going to be different for each runner. And that's discovery. You start this training process and you try to discover along this beautiful journey about what's the most that you can handle, what's going to keep making you better and better. And for each of us, that's a different number. So that's why when people say, well, how many miles should I run? Well, I don't know. You find your starting point, and then you keep improving, you keep progressing from that starting point until you don't get any more improvements, until you reach your genetic ceiling for adaptation. Bill asked another year, how do you adapt to the training you apply to it? Yeah, mine seems to be slightly different, 73 than it did 40. Yeah, when we get older, the numbers change. We can't run as much as when we get older as we can when we're younger. I can't believe you're making me feel old, Bill. I can't believe you're 73. I'm 47, and the years go by so fast. I can't believe it's been 25 years since I graduated Penn State. I can't believe time goes so fast. It seems like just yesterday. It's more than half my life ago. I can't believe it. Thank you for reminding me, Bill, that I'm also old. It's amazing how fast the time flies. But it is. I can't do as much. And you can't think of the number when you get older, the number of weekly miles. You can't think of it as the same number when you get older as when you're younger. Because, even for me to do 50 miles a week now, it's not the same as 50 miles a week when I was in my 20s. Because 50 miles a week now, it takes me longer to cover each mile. So if I were to run 50 miles a week now, that's more running than 50 miles a week when I was in my 20s. So as you get older, it's better to think in terms of time rather than in terms of mileage, because really what represents the stress is the amount of time that you're running, not necessarily how many miles per week. If you go to different countries, they do it in kilometers per week. So the distance is arbitrary. What matters is really the amount of time, because that's what represents the stress. And of course that will change when you get older because you're running each mile slower. So you can't think when you're 50 or 60 years old to try to run the same number of miles as you did when you were 20 years old, because it's going to end up being more running than when you were 20 years old. And so you always have to keep that in mind, that it's actually better to think in terms of minutes for your runs rather than miles or kilometers for your runs. Rick asked, but why doesn't time go fast when we run? That's funny. Yeah, I'm reminded of the quote by George Sheehan, the philosopher and cardiologist back in the 1990s. He said, the faster you run, the longer it takes. Because the perception of time, when you're running hard, it feels uncomfortable, and every second seems to take an eternity when you're running fast. So yeah, the faster you run, the longer it takes. It's funny how our perception of time changes when we're running easy compared to when we're running hard. Christopher says, we're all young here. I'm 55. Yes, we're all young, and time stands still when you're in social media world. And so we're all young in the social media world. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. As long as we're on social media, time doesn't exist. We're all the same age. So there's not a whole lot more to say about running economy, other than it is the most important probably of the three physiological factors, especially if you're training for longer races like a half marathon or marathon. And the most significant ways to improve it are running more, increasing the weekly volume over time. And the economy is something that changes, from month to month or year to year. It's not something that's going to improve in just a week or two. But there are some things that will hurt your economy. Like there's a lot of research to show that as a race goes on, like when you're running a long race like a marathon, your economy toward the end of the marathon is worse than your economy in the beginning of the marathon because of fatigue. Fatigue affects all these physiological factors. And so you're less economical toward the end of a marathon than you are at the beginning. Also things like downhill running, when there's muscle fiber damage, downhill running will negatively affect running economy. So there are things that acutely affect the economy, like within a given workout or within a given race. But in terms of improving your economy over time, that's something that takes time to do. Just like it takes time for a child to learn how to walk so the movements are no longer jerky and it becomes smooth. But if you have access to a lab, it's an interesting thing to measure. If you have access to a lab, what the scientists will do is put you on the treadmill and they'll pick different sub-maximum speeds. And you'll do bouts of exercise at these different speeds. Like when I did it with my dissertation, we had 6-minute bouts of exercise. And we picked different submax speeds. And we did each bout for 6 minutes, each speed for 6 minutes. And then we would rest in between. So you go 6 minutes at a given submax speed, you rest a few minutes to recover, and then another 6-minute bout at a different submax speed, then you rest a few minutes to recover. And you measure the VO2, you measure the oxygen consumption at each of these submax speeds. And then you find, what you see is when you first start, the VO2 rises and then it plateaus. And then it'll stay there for the duration of that 6-minute bout. And then for the next 6-minute bout, when you first hop on the treadmill, it'll increase first, and then it'll plateau, and then it'll stay there. Whereas if you were to get faster and faster, the VO2 will keep rising. And so when you measure running economy, you don't want it to keep rising. That's why it's done at a sub-maximum speed. Like when you go out for a run, when you first start running, your VO2 will climb just like your heart rate. When you go from standing still to running, the heart rate increases rapidly at first, and then it'll plateau, and it'll stay there for the duration of the run. It may fluctuate a little bit if you go uphill or downhill, or if it's hot outside. But for most of your run, your heart rate, especially if you're on flat ground, your heart rate, your VO2, will stay pretty consistent the whole time. It'll plateau once it increases and gets up to steady state. Then it'll stay at steady state for the duration of the entire run. And so we do that at different bouts of exercise, at different speeds. And then we can see how economical you are. And we can compare that over time to yourself. And we can compare that to other people and look at how much oxygen, what's the normal amount of oxygen. We can compare it to norm tables and look at, when you're running at 8-minute mile pace or 9-minute mile pace, what is the population? What's the average amount of oxygen you consume? How much oxygen is needed to run at that pace? And so we can compare it to other people, and then we can also compare it to yourself over time with the training plan. And you can see at the end of the plan, you're more economical than the beginning of the plan. So it's a great thing if you have access to a lab to get your economy checked, because it's an interesting thing to look at. It tells you a lot about what's going on inside your muscles and how your central nervous system is recruiting muscle fibers. So it's a very interesting thing to measure and be able to chart over time. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. So I hope you guys are getting a lot out of this. So don't neglect your running economy. It's very important. And so at the end of each show, I like to finish with a thought from Dr. Jason. And so my thought today has to do with trusting and listening. And one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of people, it's funny how the research shows what I've experienced as a coach myself, that a lot of runners just for some reason don't want to listen. And it all comes back to trust. If you really trust someone, you'll find someone who can help you, whether it's in coaching, in running, or in life. Find someone you can really trust, and then just listen to that. Put all of your trust in somebody, and then just listen. And it's a beautiful process when you do that, because you're going to get better. You're going to improve whatever it is you're trying to improve, whether it's your running or if you have a business coach or something. Just the key is finding someone who you can really give up the control to and really trust, 100% trust. And when you 100% trust another human being who's got your back, who has your best interests in mind, then just listen. Just listen to that person, and then it takes a lot of pressure off of yourself. All you have to do is listen and trust, and then the rest will take care of itself. So thank you for joining us. This is Dr. Jason. Join us next Monday for another episode of Run Talk with Dr. Jason Karp. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Bye for now.